Welcome back to Calbeckistan, a place where anybody can learn math. I'm Mr. Calbeck, and we've got another easy mode video for you today. Today we're going to be talking about the midpoint formula. By the end of this video, it's going to be the easiest formula you've ever used in geometry class, or algebra class, or whatever else you might be using it in. Let's get started. Whether you are in geometry or algebra or some other class, a lot of times you're going to need to figure out where the midpoint of something is. And all the midpoint means, don't get it all tripped up or anything, it just means halfway. So I've got a number line here, and I've got two numbers, 10 and 20. I want to find something that's the midpoint between those. What I'm looking for is what's halfway between 10 and 20. Now, anybody just looking at this screen right now, you're just like, oh yeah, well that's easy, Calbeck. That's 15. You know that. It's easy to tell. It's halfway in between. Boom, we nailed it. 15. Which is great, and you guys are good, and it's easy to do. But the question is, what if there are harder numbers? What if it's not quite as obvious what's halfway in between? For example, what if I take 7 and 18? What the heck is here? What is halfway between 7 and 18? Now, some of you may have learned in some other classes that there's a nice shortcut for this. All you really need to do is take the average. So not only does midpoint mean halfway, but it also means average. So what is the average between 7 and 18? Now, the average, if you want to find the mean average, you just add them up and divide by the number. Now, in this one, if I add 7 and 18, I get 25. Now, to find the average, I need to divide by the number of terms. And in this one, there's two numbers, so I'm going to divide by 2. 25 divided by 2. And you can put that in your calculator, but a lot of you probably actually know this. 25 divided by 2 is 12.5. So that's what's halfway in between. That's the midpoint. Now, when we're doing midpoint, and whether you're talking about coordinates on a Cartesian coordinate grid, or if you're just doing a geometric sketch, what's halfway is always found the same way. You always add them up and divide by 2. That's all you have to do. In fact, if you look at the formula of the midpoint formula, you see that it's already got the dividing by 2 part in it. So you see here in the formula, you already have the dividing by 2. And you see that things are added together. That's all we're doing. Now, it looks more complicated than it really is. All we're doing is we're finding the average. We're adding the x coordinates up here and dividing by 2, just like we did with 7 and 18. And we're adding the y coordinates up and dividing by 2. Remember, every coordinate is found with an x and y coordinate here. So I would probably, eventually this is going to give me a coordinate, x and y, and it's going to be the midpoint. Let me show you an example. Okay, I've drawn two coordinates on here. A lot of times your teachers will just give you the coordinates. But I find it's always really helpful to draw a picture of something. So if you have two coordinates that they gave you, go ahead and do a quick sketch. You don't have to be as detailed as me, but it's always a good idea to label your axes. So what I want to do here is I want to say, okay, I want to find the average of each part. But because the coordinate is always got two parts, it has an x part and a y part, has an x part and a y part. We usually think about these like that. But since I have two x's and two y's, I want to differentiate, I want to tell the difference between the two x's. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a little subscript underneath. I'm going to say this is x1, and this one I'll just call x2. Again, that's not an exponent, that's a subscript. All it does is say this is the first x and this is the second x. I'm going to do the same thing with the y's. The numbers should match. So this one should be right here, y1. This one over here needs to be y2. Again, all that means is the first y and the second y. Now you can start to see again how this lines up with the midpoint formula already. And some of you can kind of pause the video right now, go ahead and try it, see if you can find it. If you're stuck, go ahead and keep watching and you see why this is really an easy formula. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Again, all I'm really doing is I'm taking the average of the x's and I'm taking the average of the y's. You can see this visually too if we think about the number line example from the beginning. I can even draw a number line here between the x's at -2 and 4. So what's halfway between -2 and 4? Some of you can do this in your head. It's 1. Or we can put it into the formula and say, all right, x1, that's -2, x2 is 4, add them up. -2 and 4, that makes 2, divided by 2 gives you 1. So the x-coordinate of the first part is 1. Now we can do the same thing with the y's. I'll do a different color. What's halfway in between +1 and 5? And you could probably do this in your head as well. Halfway in between, you can even see it. It's 3. I can do that with the formula as well. I can just go ahead and plug it in over here. y1 is 5, y2 is 1. 5 plus 1 is 6. 6 divided by 2 is 3. And look at that. I've got my midpoint. You can even see the coordinates right here. And there's your midpoint. All the midpoint is the average of the x's, the average of the y's. And that's all it is. And it never gets more complicated than that. It will always be divided by 2. It's always going to have 2 terms. That's all you have to do.
So I was just about to publish this video and I saw a problem like this on your homework and I realized that I hadn't discussed it. So I'm going to go ahead and add this little section at the end here. Sometimes instead of giving you 2 endpoints and asking you to find the midpoint, like we did in the previous part of the video, they're going to give you 1 endpoint and the midpoint. You have to find the other endpoint. I'm going to show you how to do that one right here. There are 2 ways to solve this kind of problem. The first one I'm going to show you is by using the actual formula. Now, we have to be careful about where we plug this in, but they gave me 1 point on a line. Okay, so over here, 3 and 4, and again, it's really helpful to label this. I might put x1, y1 in here, just so that I know that that's one of the coordinates of the endpoint. This one right here is the midpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and replace the midpoint right here. The thing that makes this really scary for some people is that it looks like there's a lot of variables and it's hard to solve. But actually what's going on here is you have 2 problems. And if you break it up into 2 problems, you're going to find that it's pretty easy. All I really need to do is I need to find x2 and y2. And they're totally separate problems. So let me show you what I mean. I've got x1 is 3, and I'm going to go ahead and replace that right here. Now this, whatever that second point happens to be, is only going to give me this part of my midpoint. So if I go ahead and solve this, I'm only setting it equal to +1. So I'm going to say 1 equals 3 plus x2 over 2. Now, if you haven't looked at my solving crash course series, I have a whole video on how to solve stuff like this. So if you need a little bit more help on solving that, go ahead. I'll put a link in the description. But for those of you who feel comfortable with that, let's go ahead and solve it real quick. This is all being divided by 2, and when we're solving, we want to do the opposite. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. And what that does is that cancels it out. And again, with division, you never really cancel it out, but what you can do is divide things into a 1. Over here, I'm also going to multiply by 2, because I have to do the same thing to both sides. And then, I'm left with 2 times 1 equals 3 plus x2. Notice again, when I multiplied by 2, it canceled the whole thing out because the whole thing was divided by 2. Now I just solve. Subtract 3, and I get -1 equals x squared. No sweat. Now let's find the y1. We're going to do the same thing, except I'm just going to do the other part of the problem. All right, so remember when we're plugging this in, the y coordinate, the y part only applies to the y part of the midpoint. And I've already got y1 is 4, so I'm going to replace that here, and then just bring this down. This part right here just equals this part. So it's -1 equals 4 plus y2 divided by 2. Now I'm going to go ahead and solve this just like I did the other one. This is all being divided by 2, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 2, which divides into a 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1. I do the same thing over here. I end up with -2 on this side equals 4 plus y2. Now, I can solve for y2 really easily. I just subtract 4 from both sides, and I end up with -6. So now I have my y2 and my x2. My endpoint is just -1, -6, and you're done. Okay, it looks really scary, but remember, these are separate problems. The x's go with the x part of the midpoint, and the y's go with the y part of the midpoint. And I hope it's not quite too scary. Let me show you how you can do this with graphing. All right, I've put a graph here, and I've already plotted your points. You have your endpoint and your midpoint, and we're trying to figure out where the other endpoint is. And all you have to do, this is the cool thing about midpoints, is recognizing that it's a line, right? It's not curving, so that means that the slope of the first part is actually going to continue to the second part. So all you need to do, if you want to find the midpoint, is find the slope of the first one. Now you may have learned in Algebra 1 how to draw a slope triangle here. Now, the better your graph paper is, the better this is going to turn out. Again, my graph paper is garbage because I just drew it on the board. If you have real graph paper, this is much nicer. But I can see here that from 4, I've gone down 5 units and over 2. All I need to do to find the endpoint is continue that exact same pattern. I'm going to go down 5 more, and I'm going to go over 2. And all you need to do is then count where that final point is. And you're going to see that it's at -1, -6. Which is the exact same thing that we found with this strategy. I will give you a fair warning. Despite that this is much faster, and I always advocate drawing, drawing makes geometry so much easier than trying to do it by hand. However, if you have weird coordinates, this can be a much more difficult strategy. If you've got fractions in your coordinates or decimals or additional variables, this strategy can be really challenging to do. But if your numbers are pretty normal and in regular geometry, I think you'll find this is going to be a really great strategy for you. All right, that is it. Congratulations on finishing another easy mode video. This is Mr. Calbeck. Good luck.